welcome. In today's episode, I'm going to share encounters with black-eyed children I came across on the internet. These stories include a woman who had an encounter with a creepy boy in London, a man who had an unnerving encounter while driving one night, a poster who had a strange visitor knock on his motorhome door, and a man who saw a terrifying sight when he looked out his window. But first, we start with a story from a poster who shares his grandmother's encounter with 3 children who came to her door, and then she let them come inside. Before we get started, I just want to say that a lot of people turn to posting their stories online because they feel like they can't tell anyone and would be seen as crazy if they did. Most people who experience these beings are traumatized and feel the need to unburden themselves or just have someone who will believe them listen to their story. If you've had an encounter and you feel like you can't tell anyone for fear of being made fun of, ridiculed, called a liar, or any other reason, email me. You'll find a sympathetic ear here who will believe you. I do want to mention that just because you email me your story, it doesn't mean it will end up in an episode on my channel. Your story can stay between me and you if that's what you want. Also, if you've had an encounter and you'd like to come on an episode and tell your story, email me. My email is wolfwhocriedcryptid@gmail.com. Alright, let's get into today's stories. The first story of this episode comes from a poster who shared his grandmother's unsettling encounter with 3 children who came to her door. When she found the children at her door, they asked if they could come inside. If having 3 random children showing up at her door wasn't strange enough, they wouldn't look her in the eye. Instead, they kept their gaze fixed on the ground. One of them requested to use her phone to call their parents, and although his grandmother felt an overwhelming sense of dread, she dismissed it, thinking that they were just kids. She agreed and let them come inside. It was only then that they finally looked up at her, revealing eyes that were completely black. The grandmother had never seen anything like it and felt paralyzed as she watched them walk down the hallway, disappearing from view. After a moment, she followed, but they had simply vanished into thin air. When she told her grandson about the experience, her fear and confusion were genuine. He says she has never been one to fabricate stories or discuss the paranormal. He describes her as a traditional Turkish woman from an older generation who has never even used a computer or the internet. After hearing her story, he decided to research this phenomenon and was left in shock by what he found. The incident occurred 7 years before he posted it online, and it still sends chills down his spine whenever he thinks about it. When asked if anything bad happened after she let the children in, he replied by saying that terrible things began happening to her and the family. He doesn't go into detail because he didn't want to talk about it, but does say they had bad health issues and a lot of losses during that time. He closes by saying that things happened that using terms like bad luck wouldn't even begin to describe it. I've always heard during black-eyed children encounters that the worst thing you can do is allow them to come into your home or car and by extension your life. This is true for any paranormal entities and evil beings in general. That's why black-eyed children ask permission to enter, and they can't unless you allow them to. They might rush the door and bang on it or bang on the windows, as I've heard in many stories, but can't enter unless you allow them to. This makes me think they are demonic in nature and take the form of children, so we lower our guards and give them permission to enter our homes and our lives. When they are allowed to enter, bad things normally begin happening, with the most common being health issues that sometimes turn terminal. I wish he had gone into more detail about what he, his grandmother, and their family were forced to endure, but I understand that he wouldn't want to talk about it. I just hope whatever they were going through has stopped. What do you think about this story? Do you believe they need permission to enter our homes and by extension our lives? The next story comes from London, where one woman had an unnerving encounter with a creepy little boy. At the time of the event, she was at King's Cross Station when she noticed a little red-headed boy causing quite a ruckus as he ran around. In her words, he was being naughty and causing havoc as she watched him. The boy then turned and made eye contact with her, revealing completely black eyes, which sent a wave of dread coursing through her and made her skin crawl. The boy held her gaze for a few seconds before returning to his mischievous behavior. This unnerved her to the point that she decided not to board the train if he was on it. As fate would have it though, the boy boarded a train before hers arrived, and she has never encountered anything like that since that day. Although she says her story may seem uneventful, it was unsettling nonetheless, mainly due to the boy's eyes, which were completely devoid of any color, to the point that they had no white in them at all. She couldn't determine if they were always like that or if they had changed in that moment. Nothing sinister occurred afterward, but it certainly dampened for her what had been an enjoyable day to that point. When I hear a story like this and there is a question if the child's eyes turned black in the moment or if they always were, it makes me think that whatever these things really are can not only disguise themselves as children, as I mentioned in the first story, but also manipulate their eyes to seem normal. That is, only in certain situations. Or perhaps it wanted this woman to see its black eyes to scare her. Either way, I'm not sure what I would do if that happened to me. This story also brings to mind a couple of other stories I've heard where someone witnessed a black-eyed child in public running around acting like the child did in this story. One particular story comes to mind where a young man saw an elderly woman seemingly being led around a grocery store by a little girl running around acting like this boy. The man was taken aback when the girl stopped and looked at him with pitch black eyes, just like what happened to the woman at King's Cross Station. I don't think it's a coincidence. What do you think about this one? What would you do if that happened to you? The next story comes from a poster who had a strange experience when he drove out to his grandfather's barn one night. His brother had left his wallet there, so he went out at about 9 p.m. to get it for him. About a mile from his house, there is a steep hill leading down into a big ditch. When driving along this part of the road, you have to slow down to avoid having an accident. He mentions this because it pertains to the part of the story where he had his encounter. He arrived at the barn and went in to get the wallet, but as he reached for it, he suddenly felt like someone was watching him. As he drove back down the road near the trench-like ditch, he slowed down to a very slow speed and spotted two children standing there. He describes himself as a quote, good-natured redneck, so he decided to stop to see if they needed help. Having heard strange stories about this road while growing up, including ghostly lights and a vanishing woman who asks for a ride and screams if you agree to give her one before disappearing, this situation felt different to him. He asked the children if they were all right, thinking they might have had a mishap with their four-wheelers or something to that effect. He figured they might have been out riding them and they broke down or something. One of the children then asked for a ride, but his voice was unnaturally calm and he wouldn't meet his gaze. He turned to the other child and saw that they were covered by mosquitoes but made no attempt to swat them away. Finally, he asked the boy why he was looking down, and that's when he looked up, revealing eyes black as coal. And that was it for him. He slammed down the gas pedal and took off up the hill, barely making that sharp curve. It wasn't a dramatic escape from a demon or anything like that, he says, and they just stared at him as he sped away, kicking up gravel and dust. This is a story that hits all the points of a usual Black-Eyed Children encounter when someone is driving and they ask for a ride. Two children standing in the middle of nowhere at night with no one else around, the boy sounding unnaturally calm while speaking and not making eye contact while looking down, and them asking for a ride. The new twist though with this story is the other child standing there covered in mosquitoes and not swatting them away. This, at least for me, lets me know that black-eyed children are some sort of entities and not normal human beings. I don't blame the man in this story for peeling out and getting out of there when he did. That would be pretty scary to be in the middle of nowhere to have a child with all black eyes look up at you like that. And then for them to just stand there and watch him like they did, not at all in distress like normal children would be if they were being left behind, is even creepier. I'm glad he got out of there when he did and didn't entertain whatever these children really were. What do you think about this story? And what would you do if you came across two children standing by the side of the road in the middle of the night acting in a very strange way? The next story comes from upstate New York and is a quick one, but a good one. The original poster lived near Elmira at the time and was parked at the Lackawanna Trail truck stop in his motorhome. He also had his dog with him, which is relevant to the story. At approximately 3 a.m., there was a knock on the door. Everything surrounding the motorhome was enveloped in darkness, which was accompanied by heavy rain. When he got to the door, he found a teenage girl standing there wearing a hoodie and carrying a backpack. She asked if she could come in, but he declined and asked where her parents were, but she did not respond. Concerned for her safety, he asked if she was hungry or thirsty and offered her a bag with food and $20 inside through the window. He made a comment about her well-being, but she remained silent, briefly glancing at his dog who stood next to him and chuckling. That's when his dog started barking uncontrollably and he noticed her eerie, pale complexion and unsettling, pitch-black eyes. He immediately shut the window, grabbed his gun, and watched as she walked onto the old railroad tracks by the highway before disappearing from sight. I'm not sure what I would do if someone looked at my dog and chuckled like that, but if she went into a barking frenzy like the dog in this story, I would have reacted the same way the man did here. I always say listen to your gut instinct, which doesn't really apply here, and to pay attention to the behavior of animals, especially your pets, because they are privy to things that we are not. That said though, I don't think he needed his dog to start barking to notice that the girl was acting very weird. And then for her to just walk off into the night in the pouring rain would be unsettling too. I don't think I would have gotten much sleep that night, and I would have definitely kept my firearm on me or within arm's reach. What do you think about this story? Does it make you not want to answer the door at night? The final story of this episode comes to us from a poster who had a bizarre, terrifying encounter with an old woman who had black eyes and posted his story online to get some opinions from anyone who came across it. This is just another in a line of stories I've found where someone encounters an adult with black eyes rather than a child. He says he believes there's a rational explanation for what happened, but also wants to hear opinions, similar encounters, and theories regarding black-eyed children. This story takes place back in 1996 or 97 when he lived close to a cemetery at the end of a road. One night he found himself still awake at his computer. The glow of the screen illuminated his bedroom, which overlooked the street. It was around 2 or 3 a.m. when his eyes got heavy and he decided to take a break and wandered over to the window. He gazed down the road toward the cemetery even though it was too far for him to see clearly. To his surprise, he noticed 3 figures slowly making their way down the street. They appeared to be quite elderly and were dressed in what looked like funeral attire, which struck him as odd given the late hour. There were 2 women and a man, all seemingly around 80 years old, according to his estimation. The woman in the center seemed to need support as she was being steadied by the other woman and the man. As they drew nearer, he sensed that she was distressed. His initial thought was that she might have recently lost her husband, and her grief had led her to wander near the cemetery at such an hour, with the other 2 accompanying her to ensure she got home safely. He found the scene intriguing enough to keep watching as they approached his house. Just in front of his house stood a street lamp, and he watched them as they passed by. When they reached the lamppost, they all stopped, and the distressed woman in the center glanced up at him with a grin. That's when things took a strange turn. Her smile changed into a grimace, and any color that had been on her face vanished, leaving it ghostly white. In that moment, he found himself locked onto her gaze, but her eyes were an unsettling pitch black. Time seemed to stretch on forever. He describes it as being reminiscent of that surreal moment just before a car crash where everything slows down as your mind processes an overwhelming amount of information. Although their eye contact lasted only a second, it felt like an eternity. His peripheral vision faded and all he could do was focus on those two dark voids on her face, which felt like they were pulling him in. Despite the distance between them remaining unchanged, it felt as if she was inching closer. He was vaguely aware that her two companions were still staring down the street, seemingly frozen, waiting for her to conclude whatever was happening. Then, suddenly, a wave of dread and panic washed over him, prompting him to drop to the floor. Once he broke her gaze, he felt foolish for being so frightened by this clearly distressed elderly woman who seemed to need assistance. He peered out the window again, but they had vanished. The road was long and straight, and there was no way they could have disappeared from view so quickly, especially not three elderly people. He ends by asking for ideas about what he saw that night and if it's possible his tired eyes were just playing tricks on him. But he does say it felt way too real, and to this day he can still vividly remember every detail of the encounter and the amount of dread he felt staring into the woman's eyes. He also still gets chills when he tells his story. This story is different in the way that the black-eyed lady didn't try to get inside the man's home, but rather seemed to put him into a trance. To what end, I can't say, and I won't venture a guess. I do believe this being, just like all the others, had malicious intent. The fact that they vanished seemingly into thin air after this only solidifies for me that they were something other than human, because I don't think three elderly people could get out of sight that quickly, much less on a long straight road. Besides, what were they doing walking down the road at that time of night, much less coming out of a cemetery? And he says they were dressed like they had just come from a funeral. I don't know many funerals that are held at that time of night. That being said, I don't think these were ordinary people or human at all, if I'm being honest. More likely something dark and sinister, especially based on the encounter this man had with them. What do you think about this one? What would you do if you looked out your window at night and something like that happened to you? Also, what do you think black-eyed children and adults really are? Demonic entities like I believe them to be, or something else entirely? And that's going to do it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed these stories. If you'd like to hear more stories like these and other types of cryptids, make sure to subscribe to the channel. If you want to send me your story, I'd love to read it. My email is wolfwhocriedcryptid@gmail.com. I will also put it in the description below. With your permission, I may want to use it in an episode. Even if you'd prefer that I didn't share your story on my channel and just want someone to listen, email me. We can privately talk about your encounter. And please remember to keep it civil in the comments section. No one deserves to be ridiculed whether they believe or not. Thank you for listening. I'll catch you at the next episode.